also get out and experience some of that nice warm sunshine. This is a look at next week. It's going to be a whole different story. On Monday, we can see a few showers, mainly late in the day. There might be a sprinkle in the morning, upper 50s and mid 60s, so still above average. Then Tuesday, Wednesday, rain. And the rain may be mixed with snow at times during the coldest period, but more rain than snow Tuesday and Wednesday. And colder air is going to be coming in because of it's also going to be breezy Tuesday and Wednesday. We'll be cooling back to the 40s and the 50s. Here you see the temperatures right now. Everybody's above average. Very little in the way of wind, and a nice evening on the way. Clouds have moved to the east. They're in Minnesota and Iowa. Also along the Wyoming border, but KELO land is remaining with blue sky the rest of the evening. Over.
Sioux Falls Arena, the annual syrup races have returned. Dubbed the Concrete Challenge, motorcycles, ATVs, go-karts, even lawnmowers will face off on a track that is covered with concentrated soda syrup. That substance gives the indoor track more grit and more stick, resulting in a lot more traction for those rubber tires.
Once people associate a name with an event and they have a good time at the event, then it'll stick with them. So we need to get the Concrete Challenge into people's brains that they're going to come out and have a good time watching us put on a show.
The races start with a test and tune tonight. Race day kicks off tomorrow at noon. The main event is at 7. Tickets are $20 for adults and $15 for kids under 12. A KSFY turned Dakota News Now legend is saying goodbye to our organization this week. Marty Heathcote started with KSFY on March 20th, 1978. That is 44 years of hard work and dedication to the station. And to celebrate his retirement, Marty and the crew joined in the newsroom afternoon for one of Marty's favorites, carrot cake. We wish him well in his much-deserved time off. Marty, thank you for everything. Phil will have a final check of the forecast. That's when we come back here on KSFY. A reminder to get your weekend started with Dakota News Now. Join Cordell Wright and Austin Haskins Saturday and Sunday mornings at 9. It is news when you want it.
The First Alert Weather Team helps you plan.
Hi, I'm Comfy.
Including infections, tuberculosis, lymphoma, other cancers.
Spoke to said this is literally a 24-hour hacking operation with people all over the world. They have managed to shut down several Russian government websites and news websites over the last couple of weeks. But they're also doing some things that I didn't realize Anonymous even did. They've got this text messaging campaign. They created this software where they now have millions of Russian cell phone numbers, and they are now texting and engaging with people in Russia, trying to give them real-time information about the war, even sending pictures from the war, information that they wouldn't normally be able to get because all of the media in Russia is state-run. Listen to what this member of Anonymous told me this afternoon.
What you have right now is a global cyber war like nothing I've ever seen, and I've been a part of Anonymous for going on a couple of decades now. The Russian propaganda has claimed several times to have arrested Anonymous, and there's clearly that lack of understanding that Anonymous is a hive. You cannot take down the hive. The queen is an idea, it is not a person.
It's interesting, there's really not just one person involved, and there are other groups too, Mike, working on these sort of campaigns. There's even another group that has gone to Tinder, the dating website. So many other social websites have been shut down. This other group is using Tinder to try and communicate with Russians and give them information about the war.
You know, it's amazing. You see someone in that Guy Fawkes mask and with the name Anonymous or part of the group Anonymous, and you think that you sort of equate them with sort of a villain. Right, but they're wearing the white hats in this story, at least trying to get inside Russia and tell people what's actually happening. So let me ask you this. How do you know she was definitely part of Anonymous if she won't show her face, or this person won't show their face or divulge any kind of information?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it is tricky because all of these people are anonymous, and a lot of them don't even know that each other are in the group. But the way that I got in touch with her was through one of these sort of official anonymous social media accounts. So that was sort of giveaway number one, that this was someone actually associated with the group. And then all of the documentation that I asked her to send in terms of, they've got secret websites that they use with all of these Russian phone numbers, and then they've got other websites they use to text message with the Russians. She was very quick to send me all of that information. Also, they hacked into these Russian surveillance camera systems inside different government buildings, and she was very happy to send me those secret websites where I actually saw the surveillance video for myself. So I personally have no doubt that this person is very much involved.
Well, you know, I'm fascinated by this story, how a man can keep this information silo, his country blocked off from in the social media age, in the cyber age, and apparently he can't do it all that well. There's still ways in. Brian Ensign, thank you very much. Fascinating report. Okay, so take a look at this. More than 100 empty strollers placed in a Lviv square. They were put there by the Price of War campaign, led by local activists to honor the large number of children killed so far in the ongoing Russian invasion. Yet another heartbreaking image from Putin's war of conquest. Basketball star Brittany Griner will spend at least the next 2 months in a Russian jail. Still ahead, the two possible paths to get her back home. And are either of them likely to work? And before the night is out, Leah Thomas may have a second NCAA swimming championship. We will raise the issue of fairness with another trans athlete.
Need a... Hey there, it's Molly.
Pretty sure people call it.
Your tax dollars go further at iMart Express. 2 pairs starting under $40. With rewards, dining, and entertainment. The excitement never ends at Dakota Sioux Casino and Hotel.
Saturday, March 26th, 1 p.m. to 10 p.m. Be one of the 95 Clovers of Cash giveaway winners. At 10 p.m., take your chance at $5,000.
An Escape, 7 Goat Modes, and Bronco Sport.
This weekend at Royal River Casino and take the crown. Henkel operates
18 and newer used inventory, or 2. Take $2,000 off the advertised price if you qualify and finance with American National Bank on clearly marked Red Dot 2018 and newer used inventory. Shop a huge selection, all clearly marked to easily spot the savings at more at Auto Glasses made in store only at iMart Express.
Sunshine rules KELO land.
Developing stories as we come on the air. For the first time, Russia strikes in Lviv, Ukraine, just 40 miles from the Poland border. Verified video circulating on social media tonight showing the explosion near the airport in Lviv. Ukraine says the missiles came from Russian aircraft firing from the Black Sea. 4 missiles appearing to hit the target, 2 intercepted. Lviv, Ukraine, until now, had been a safe place for tens of thousands of refugees, one of their last stops in Ukraine before getting out. Tonight, Russia's foreign minister and his new threat to the U.S. and the West, calling new military shipments legitimate targets. Stark new images here of a bombed-out Mariupol tonight and the staggering new report on the humanitarian crisis. Vladimir Putin in public in Moscow today, his declaration. And the powerful scene back in Lviv, Ukraine tonight, 109 strollers representing the 109 children killed since the war began. Martha Raddatz standing by live in Ukraine, Victor Akendo live in Poland tonight. President Biden and the high-stakes phone call with China's President Xi today, the nearly 2-hour conversation after reports Russia asked China for help, military help, potentially economic help amid crippling sanctions. Mary Bruce live at the White House on what was said on that call. Tonight, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is extraordinarily popular inside Russia, and his very personal plea direct to Russian soldiers. You will hear it, what Schwarzenegger says about his own father and his message to Vladimir Putin tonight. Back here at home, the pandemic tonight, and Moderna now requesting emergency authorization for a 4th shot, another booster for all adults in this country. Dr. Jha tonight, should Americans prepare for another booster given the rise in cases of this highly transmissible Omicron subvariant? The severe weather threat at this hour from Florida all the way up to New York State. Dangerous storms damaging homes already, at least 6 people hospitalized. Ginger Z times this out as we start the weekend. The stunning upset kicking off March Madness, and the other moment, the cheerleaders saving the day. And the Russian ballet star tonight, her message to Vladimir Putin and where she has now ended up.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with David Muir.
Good evening, and it's great to have you with us as we near the end of another week together. And we begin tonight with the war in Ukraine. For the first time since the Russian invasion, missiles today hitting Lviv, Ukraine, about 40 miles from the Polish border. Until now, Lviv has been considered relatively safe, especially for the tens of thousands of refugees trying to get out of that country still. The target hit with missiles fired from the Black Sea. A verified image posted on social media showing a missile exploding as it hits near the airport in Lviv. Ukraine claims Russia fired 6 missiles, that 2 were intercepted. A senior defense official reporting with Russian ground troops stalled outside Kyiv and other cities that the Russians are increasingly using artillery and long-range missiles, which is what we've now seen in Lviv. The haunting scenes out of Mariupol tonight, and the UN with the alarming new report on the humanitarian crisis. Nearly 6.5 million people displaced inside Ukraine. That's in addition to the more than 3 million who have already left. Well, more than 9 million Ukrainians now forced to flee. And in Moscow tonight, Vladimir Putin center stage at a massive pro-war rally, falsely accusing Ukrainians of genocide, praising Russian troops as heroes. And the moment state TV appeared to cut away from his speech, what the Kremlin insists tonight. President Biden and China's President Xi speaking for nearly 2 hours today. Russia has reportedly asked China for help, military help or economic help, given these crippling sanctions. So Mary Bruce is standing by at the White House tonight with what we've learned about the call. Also tonight, Arnold Schwarzenegger and his very personal plea to the Russians, to Russian soldiers directly. He is very popular in Russia, and the message about his own father. But we are going to begin tonight with this newest Russian target, Lviv, Ukraine, and that's where our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, leads us off tonight.
Tonight, for the first time, Russia attacking Lviv, a bustling city which was considered a safe haven just 40 miles from Poland. Verified video circulating on social media showing 2 of the explosions slamming into an aircraft repair facility near the main airport. The Russians firing 6 cruise missiles from the Black Sea, hundreds of miles away. At least 2 of the missiles were intercepted before they could reach their target. With today's missile strike just there beyond the airport, the Russians are sending a powerful message. Lviv has been a critical place for refugees trying to get out of Ukraine and a critical pipeline for humanitarian aid and supplies. And tonight, the sheer scope of the refugee crisis now all too clear. A UN agency today estimating that 6.5 million people have been displaced inside Ukraine since the fighting began. Over 3 million have already fled the country, meaning nearly a quarter of Ukraine's population has been displaced. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov further raising tensions with the West today, warning that any military shipments to Ukraine will be considered legitimate targets.
Any cargo moving into Ukrainian territory, which we would believe is carrying weapons, would be a fair game.
Lavrov's boss, Vladimir Putin, appeared at a huge rally in Moscow today. Before a flag-waving crowd of thousands, Putin repeated false claims that Russia's invasion was meant to prevent the genocide of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. Putin's speech was abruptly interrupted when the feed cut away to a lively musical performance in the stadium, the Kremlin dismissing it as a technical glitch. Putin used the speech to praise his troops. But the reality is Putin's ground forces are stalled on the battlefield as the fighting enters its 4th week, prompting him to increasingly turn to long-range weapons staged in Russia itself to wage his war. The drawn-out fight and Putin's desperation has the U.S. and NATO worried that Putin will turn to even deadlier tactics, including chemical, biological, or even small-yield battlefield nuclear weapons to break the stalemate. The use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield is part of Russian military doctrine, and the horrors it could unleash risk involving the U.S. and NATO more deeply in this conflict.
These are smaller yield, smaller weapons, but they still carry lots of radioactivity, and they're still a big step along the scale of escalation to strategic nuclear war.
Ukrainian and Russian officials did hold a fifth straight day of ceasefire talks. Russia's lead negotiator tonight claiming the two sides have moved much closer on the question of Ukraine giving up any ambitions to join NATO. Ukraine saying it has agreed to nothing and wants an immediate ceasefire, Russian troop withdrawal, and international security guarantees. As the talks drag on, the suffering only gets worse. In the besieged city of Mariupol, it's still not clear how many casualties there may have been after a Russian airstrike on a theater serving as a shelter. Seen here in images from the Azov Battalion, a far-right paramilitary group now part of the Ukrainian National Guard. Ukrainian officials say as many as 1,000 people were inside. At least 130 people have reportedly been rescued, but hundreds remain unaccounted for. In the capital, Kyiv, another round of shelling today. Emergency responders racing to save civilians and put out fires triggered by the indiscriminate attacks. And back in Lviv, a heartbreaking moment today as 109 empty baby strollers were lined up in a city square to symbolize the 109 Ukrainian children killed in this war so far.
Just an extraordinary image tonight. Martha Raddatz with us live from Lviv. And Martha, that city, again, not far from the Poland border, of course. And you and I were on the air last night. Your sources had been telling you the Russians would be relying more and more on long-range weapons because the ground troops are stalled, the Russian ground troops, and it would appear that that's what we're seeing here.
Exactly, David. Vladimir Putin is frustrated by the pace of this invasion, especially those bogged-down convoys around Kyiv. And we've heard Putin remind the world that Russia is a nuclear-powered country. The head of the Defense Intelligence Agency saying Russia will use that rhetoric to project strength, but there is no hard intelligence, as far as we know, indicating he will actually use those weapons. But it is a concern, David.
And Martha, while we have you, the other breaking headline as we're on the air, we know of these NATO exercises elsewhere in Europe. What do you know tonight about reports of a missing American Osprey somewhere in Europe tonight?
Well, there is a search and rescue underway for crew members on board that Osprey. They're taking part in these huge NATO exercises in Norway, joined by 3,000 U.S. Marines. David?
All right, Martha Raddatz leading us off here on a Friday night. Martha, thank you. And as you heard Martha report there, the humanitarian crisis is worsening now. 6 million people displaced inside Ukraine. More than 3 million more have already fled that country. In neighboring Poland, millions are now seeking help. Victor Akendo from Warsaw.
Tonight, the displaced just keep coming from every corner of war-ravaged Ukraine, overwhelming major cities like Warsaw. But just 40 minutes away in the town of Milanovic, a community opening their doors to those most in need.
And to be clear, you've never met before, right?
Ale jakby, żeby była jasność, państwo się nie znacie. Nie znamy się.
This mother and son fleeing Ukraine, those bags containing all they could carry, but instead of staying in a shelter, a local Polish woman taking them to stay with her mother. Of the more than 3 million refugees spreading to countries throughout Europe, more than 2 million are in Poland. In this town of just 16,000 people, they've welcomed 600 refugees.
There's no way, as a dad, I can look at mums with kids, right, and not cry and think, what can we do?
Andrew Eddles offering his spare cottage to 14-year-old Oleva's family. Oleva pictured here with his younger sister, mother, and grandmother last May, fleeing Kharkiv along with his cousin after spending days inside this bomb shelter with their dog.
Here it's way better. First of all, no explosions.
So you feel safer here?
I feel way safer here.
Tonight, all have a roof over their heads and beds to call their own.
Oh.
Poland is now providing refugees with the equivalent of Social Security numbers. This will allow them to legally find work or apply for a mortgage. In just one day, 123,000 Ukrainians were provided those new numbers. David?
Victor Kendo from Warsaw tonight. Victor, thank you. Tonight, President Biden and his high-stakes phone call with China's President Xi. Their phone call lasting nearly 2 hours today. President Biden warning of the consequences if China provides Russia with military or economic help. But the White House insisting the president made no specific requests of President Xi. Our Mary Bruce pressing the White House on that very point today.
A senior official said that the president was really sort of laying out his assessment of the situation to President Xi, that he was making clear the implications of certain actions, but that President Biden wasn't making specific requests of China. Why not, and given the stakes here?
Because China has to make a decision for themselves about where they want to stand and how they want the history books to look at them and view their actions. And that is a decision for President Xi and the Chinese to make.
So let's bring in Mary Bruce. She's live at the White House tonight. The White House obviously very cautious as they negotiate here anything involving Russia with China.
David, the White House describes this call as detailed, direct, and substantive, but tonight they aren't sharing those details. The administration believes it's more constructive for them to be tight-lipped about these talks. We do know that President Biden laid out for the Chinese president the serious implications and consequences of aligning with Russia, but it's not clear if President Xi got the message. In a lengthy but vague statement, the Chinese called it a candid and in-depth discussion, but they're also holding their cards close. Tonight, we still don't know if China has decided to help Russia either economically or militarily, or if China is going to denounce Russia's invasion. The Chinese still calling this war a, quote, situation in Ukraine. David.
Mary Bruce live at the White House. We'll be watching this closely. Mary, thank you. Tonight we're learning more here about a very personal message from Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is extraordinarily popular inside Russia. His plea direct to Russian soldiers. What Schwarzenegger says about his own father and his message to Vladimir Putin tonight. The question, of course, how many Russians will see and hear this? Here's ABC's Matt Gutman.
Tonight, there's no way of knowing just how many Russians have seen the message from Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he is extraordinarily popular there, and this was personal, his plea to stop the war.
I'm sending this message through various different channels to reach my dear Russian friends and the Russian soldiers serving in Ukraine.
He told the Russian people and soldiers, you are not being told the truth.
I ask you to help me spread the truth. Let your fellow Russians know the human catastrophe that is happening in Ukraine.
Gentle and fatherly, the former California governor and actor begins with a story about his own boyhood hero, a Russian.
Let me just tell you about the Russian who became my hero. In 1961, when I was 14 years old,
Yuri Vlasov, then the world's strongest man.
He reached out to shake my hand. He was kind, and he smiled at me. I will never forget that day. Never.
His story, a way to connect personally with the Russian soldiers. And Schwarzenegger, just one of 3 American public figures followed by the Russian presidency on Twitter. And he has a message for President Putin.
To President Putin, I say, you started this war. You're leading this war. You can stop this war.
Schwarzenegger then telling Russian soldiers about his own father and the guilt he carried fighting for the Nazis in World War II. He says his dad came home a broken man.
He lived the rest of his life in pain. Pain from a broken back, pain from the shrapnel that always reminded him of these terrible years, and pain from the guilt that he felt.
Schwarzenegger closing by saying those brave enough to stand up to Putin and against this war are his new heroes.
The world has seen your bravery. We know that you have suffered the consequences of your courage. You have the strength of Yuri Petrovich Vlasov.
David, the White House telling us it did not direct Arnold Schwarzenegger to produce that video. A spokesman for the former governor saying it came from Arnold's heart, not the government. Now, his team managing to post that video onto Telegram, one of the few social media outlets that has managed to evade censorship in Russia. David.
And so interesting that Schwarzenegger is followed by the Russian presidency. Matt Gutman tonight. Matt, thank you. Our coverage of
clogs and embarrassing odors.
Non-substantive disappearance of people. So that not only hurts those people and is unfair, period, it also hurts the rest of us in society when we're denied those talents and skills. So I appreciate your point there. I'm curious what you thought of the White House. We showed this because I was there and talking to them. And it's always funny as a journalist, a lot of civil rights advocates I know are excited that she would be the first defender, as mentioned, since Marshall. You bring that up around the White House and the politics of this, the first thing they say is, yeah, that's cool, but look at the police endorsement, look at the other stuff. I'm curious what you think about all that.
Well, I think it's hilarious, of course, because the beauty of Brown Jackson is that she is just so amazingly well qualified. And people got to realize that the Supreme Court takes up a lot of criminal justice cases every year. Yeah. I have to teach, the Supreme Court review each year. And I'm always shocked at some of their bad reasoning on some of these cases. And that just shows that they really don't have a grounding in criminal justice law and an understanding of what the effect of their decisions will be. So it's very, very important to have somebody who is grounded in criminal law. The White House is making a mistake. They should make that one of her strengths, because that is a beauty for this nation. We need somebody on that court who not only has the racial diversity, the gender diversity, the intersectionality of the two, but also who can bring so much more to the court. Her experience on that U.S. Sentencing Commission, that has to be primarily talked about. And how good she is at working across, ideologies and working across, the aisle, or as people like to say, and all the other things that she is just remarkable. And I think that her constituent building within courts, her really careful and amazing judicial writing, and her experience as a criminal justice defender is going to make her just stellar. And I can't wait. I mean, I want to see what Josh Hawley has to say. I want to see what anybody has to say about her. I mean, didn't you think it was funny, Ari, that the best thing to say when she was first nominated was that she was overqualified? That she was a Harvard twice, and that made her too elite? I said, oh, really? Really?
It's true. The point you make, especially for jobs like that where education's part of it, it was something to say, gosh, suddenly this is too much Harvard. I didn't hear Harvard being a negative when it was John Roberts, etc. I got to go to the break, Barbara. There's so much going on in the world, but this is going to be an important thing for the reasons you stated. For people who know you, they know your substantive enthusiasm, and if those don't know you, well, if they watch tonight, they see it. It's lovely to talk to you again.
Thank you for having me. I remember I advocated for a black woman on the court all during the Obama years. This is not new, folks. This is the culmination of centuries of black women's hearts, centuries of women's hearts, centuries of people seeking justice. Thank you.
Yeah. There it is. The last word on that from Barbara. Thank you. When we come back, we look at some glimmers of hope abroad. Stay with us.
Issue. With that, let's bring in our panel. Jason Riley, Wall Street Journal columnist and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Kimberly Strassel, a member of the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal. And Jeff Mason, who is on White House pool duty in the back of a van, White House correspondent for Reuters. Guys, I apologize for the allergies. They just kicked in today. Jeff, what about this call and the significance of it with the Chinese leader?
Well, certainly significant, Brett, because the White House and the United States government in general do not want Xi Jinping and China to aid Russia. And the Secretary of State actually was pretty clear in his remarks yesterday that if China does decide to help Russia in any way, that there will be consequences. And that's certainly something that would have come up on the call today between Biden and his counterpart. The White House, especially in the clip that you just played, didn't give a whole lot of details about that call. It went on for quite a while. It was about an hour and a half. But you have to assume that President Biden was pretty direct in saying, don't be an ally for Putin in this invasion.
Jeff, Reuters had the story about Chinese carrier sails through the Taiwan Strait hours before the Biden-Xi call. The sailing happened about 12 hours before U.S. President Joe Biden due to speak to his Chinese counterpart. Kimberly, they've been doing provocative things for a while, flying these jets into Taiwan airspace and other things.
Yeah, and that might actually even explain some of why China has actually seemingly taken Russia's side here. It seems to be making a little bit of a global power play itself and trying to use this as a moment to send a message to the United States and the West to stay out of its sphere of influence in Asia. And it might even be hoping that Ukraine falls and that the NATO alliance doesn't succeed in propping up Ukraine, because it may feel it gives it a better claim or more ability to assert its own dominance over Taiwan. But I think that actually gets to one of the strategic importances of what NATO is doing in helping Ukraine in its own fight.
Jason?
Well, we're in a bad situation here, Brett. When you
can get it, we'll tell you why.
I've always focused on my career, but when we found out our son had autism, his future became my focus. Lavender baths always calmed him, so we turned bath time into a business. And building it with my son has been my dream job.
At Northwestern Mutual, our version of financial planning helps you live your dreams today. Find a Northwestern Mutual advisor at
1-800-920.
The World Tonight on BNC News and a former State Department senior advisor. Nayyirah, it is always great to see you. So let's talk first about the incentives that China has. So China says Russia is its good friend. Well, let's put up the graphic of how much business they actually do with Russia versus how much they do with us. The EU is actually the entity in the world they do the most business with, $828 billion versus $755.6 billion with the United States. We all know there's so many products made in China in the United States. They only do about $146 billion with Russia. What on earth would be their incentive to side with this country that's essentially deteriorating?
Some of it is strategic, Joy. The idea that Russia and China were together against the West. Russia had been supporting China in its expansion over in the East. And now what President Xi really has to try and thread the needle is between maintaining a relationship with its largest neighbor, saying that it is still a friend of Russia, while also condemning the attacks in Ukraine and not being seen as supporting that. Now, China does have a significant amount of U.S. debt. It is technically, it's $1 trillion in U.S. treasuries, means it is the largest foreign bank for the U.S. government, so they have leverage over us. They also have the leverage of, the U.S. Takes more from China than we give to them in terms of imports of all of the consumer goods. The semiconductor shortage is largely because of supply chain and production issues in China. So they have deeply embedded economic ties with the United States. So they think if they thread this needle right, they can play both sides. They can keep the trade with the United States and keep their partner Russia happy.
Let's talk about just sort of the shifts, because it has seemed to me that their support hasn't been full-throated for what Putin is doing. And this is from the Washington Post. Among shifts in wording was Xi's decision to call the invasion a war for the first time when speaking with his German and French counterparts last week, a departure from weeks of officials describing the war the way that Putin wants it described, as a special military operation or a situation. They did, sort of stand to the side in the UN when the rest of the world condemned Russia. But do you detect any movement in China's direction toward being with the rest of the world rather than being with this rogue country?
Their abstention at the United Nations was significant. Now it's just saying that they're not going to participate. But they usually, when it came to the Syrian war, even when it came to the invasion of Crimea, they would generally support full-throated defense of Russia. But what they're looking at is what Putin is also looking at, that his invasion of Ukraine is not going well. He has not been able to take over the country as he suspected, and as the Chinese and probably been discussing with him after the Olympics, thinking that, okay, just wait until the Olympics are over, then start your invasion. So now China is looking at potentially being on the losing side of this, and they don't want to be stuck with having to help Putin save face on the world stage or get ostracized from all of his economic opportunities. So the threat of consequences that the United States has laid on China would be economic sanctions, and that's something that deeply worries the Chinese, again, as the entire world is looking to come out of this global pandemic.
In a way, China, and I've said this before, is sort of, in a sense, potentially the winner in the Game of Thrones if Russia is no longer a superpower. And I think it's clear they are not any longer. They've exposed themselves by doing this invasion, this disastrous invasion. But China then sort of moves up in the world, right? I mean, the United States government has already assessed that they are our biggest threat/competitor. In a sense, would Russia benefit from the end of Russia's top-tier status?
There used to be a in U.S. diplomacy where it was all about, especially post-World War II, you'll hear about the liberal order and working towards Europe and building up those alliances. And around the Clinton administration, fast forward through Obama, you started hearing about a reset or a pivot to Asia. Now, whether or not that was ever successful is another debate, but that was because there was a recognition that China is looming large on the world stage, right? They are the ones who have built trade with Southeast Asia. There's the constant threat of their military in the South China Sea. So this does end up being, if they can play both sides right, if they pull away from Russia just enough to keep the United States happy, you have a hermetically sealed Soviet-era type Russia, which never had the economic power China did, and suddenly China now dominates the East against a unified West.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Nair Hawk, my friend, thank you very much. Always appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And coming up next, the confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson begin on Monday. What to expect next on The Readout. Stay right there.
And finishes. So stand up and relax. Order your American.
J.D. Mellberg. That's right, free. This book reveals little-known truths about.
Will you go out?
Communicating these ideas.
I really.
You won $1,000. We're happy.
Because of how much you believe in your country. But it's a pretty incredible thing that you are willing to lose your life if it comes to that, Alex.
Well, it's war. What can I say? You have to be ready to die and kill. So I had to take that decision sitting in Turkey. And for sure I had some doubts, but why am I worse than any person who is staying here? And there's many famous people staying here. There's many normal people staying here. Old people, children, I mean, they for sure will need help. And I think if everyone thinks that I'll help from outside of the country, then that's a problem for the country. So I'm here. I'm going to help with what I can. If I need to fight, I'll fight.
So, Alex, you know, you played tennis, obviously, at the top level in the world, right? U.S. Open, Wimbledon, and every other major tournament. You always ended your matches, you know, as you do, with a handshake. And you played against Russians. And, you know, you obviously, I'm sure, like everyone, have friends who are Russian. Could you ever imagine you'd be in a situation like this where you would be fighting against them?
No, I never thought it would go this deep, but now it's gone to another level. And since I think the second day of this war, they started really targeting civilians. So it became a business of every Ukrainian. You can't just watch how they shoot your people. I mean, once it's not a fight against armies, then it becomes a fight against, you know, the whole nation. And that's what Russia doesn't understand. They can never win, because if I need to get my connections going to get into territorial defense, then you must understand that almost every man here is ready to take a weapon and fight. And how do you fight such motivated people? I mean, yeah, they bomb us. That's the problem. They bomb, and civilians die. But they took one big city, because they are not really motivated. They're on our land, and most of them are saying that we don't understand what we're fighting for. And we do understand what we're fighting for, so just like that.
All right, well, Alex, I am grateful for your time and for sharing your story and your resolve with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And out front next, a pill that can protect the body against some nuclear exposure. Suddenly, there's a huge spike in demand around the world.
Who said you have to starve yourself to lose weight?
Who said you can't do dinner?
Who said only this is good and this is bad? I'm doing it my way.
Meet Plenity, an FDA-cleared, clinically proven weight management aid for adults with a BMI of 25 to 40 when combined with diet and exercise. Plenity is not a drug. It's made from naturally derived building blocks and helps you feel fuller and eat less. It is a prescription-only treatment and is not for pregnant women or people allergic to its ingredients. Talk to your doctor or visit myplenity.com to learn more.
As a struggling actor, I need all the breaks that I can get. At Liberty Butchamug.
Cut.
Liberty Bibbity.
Cut. We'll dub it.
Liberty Mutual customizes your car insurance so you only pay for what you need.
Only pay for what you need.
Liberty, liberty, liberty.
5.
This program was made possible by
Mary 31, he's trying to shoot himself in the head now.
Hey, stop right here!
Sierra, please, put it down! Put it down now!
Now, a lot of the crime is driven by either homeless addicts or the mentally ill who have effectively taken over downtown Seattle. You see addicts openly smoking fentanyl, shooting up all over the place. Stores have been forced to close.
Plans in terms of the budgeting.
What is the future of the bill?
bathtubs and
with the R.
Affection, showing affection.
The American contractors at the same time got a tax break under Ukrainian legislation. So what did the Ukrainian scientists receive in return, i.e. the Ukrainian people? Free travel to international conferences based on expenses for food and accommodation as established by for US civil servants. This kind of compensation is carried out, that's the compensation provided for working alongside dangerous biological science. This is not the noble assistance to Ukraine that the American representatives talk about. This is a cynical use of its territory and population for dangerous research, which Washington does not carry out on its own territory, so it doesn't run a risk of hurting its own people. Won't be surprised if similar facts about
2019 decision denying the Trump claim of immunity, writing her an opinion, quote, "Presidents are not kings. They do not have subjects bound by loyalty or blood." Her nomination comes at a crucial moment as Trump's tilting of the court to the right is chipping away at our freedoms, which is why you have Republicans like insurrection fan Josh Hawley saying garbage like Jackson has a pattern of letting child porn offenders off the hook. Yeah. A desperate cherry-picked lie that fails to mention how Judge Jackson issued sentences that were consistent with or above the government recommendations in the overwhelming majority of her cases. It just proves how conservatives are really having a hard time finding an effective way to smear her. Even America's largest policing organization endorsed Judge Jackson, which saw Republicans are resorting to their MAGA cult playbook, using racism to stoke anti-woke rage. Putin puppet and failed CIA candidate Tucker Carlson even demanded he needed to see Judge Jackson's LSAT scores in order that reeked of anti-blackness and show me your papers birtherism, while others have deemed her a radical. It all boils down to the usual racism and misogyny. The radical black lady, the unqualified black lady, the black woman chosen only on the basis of her race and gender. Rinse, repeat. Meanwhile, Judge Jackson brings more judicial experience to the bench than many of the other justices, including Chief Justice John Roberts. The Republicans are going to have a hard time finding ways to discredit her. Now, Katanji and I were undergraduates at Harvard at the same time, so I can personally attest that she is brilliant, focused, studious, and kind. And standing in her way would be very stupid politics for Republicans or for their conservative Democratic friends. We are pretty close to making some pretty remarkable history, but we're also bracing ourselves for racism and sexism to be right in the spotlight next week at these hearings.
And this is my world.
Welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight, there are a lot of things going on around the world at the moment, but we thought we would begin tonight with a report from your own country, just to give you something a little different from what you've been watching every moment of every day for the past 3 weeks. On your screen are pictures from Brooklyn, New York. These are people waiting in line at a food bank. The queue stretches for blocks. It's what we used to call a bread line. Most of these people are not homeless or not addicted to drugs. Some of them have jobs. They just can't afford enough food. Very few living Americans have ever seen anything like this. It's been nearly 100 years since the United States experienced widespread food shortages. That's long enough that most of us have forgotten what it means. And here's what it means. If you want to make a society volatile, not just angry and divided, which is where we are now, but revolutionary and explosive, then you threaten the food supply. More governments have fallen to rising food prices than to any other cause by far. Hungry people are dangerous.
There are two different narratives. One of a country under siege by ruthless attacks against men, women, children, and babies. The second is one that is being written by Vladimir Putin, who is trying to rally Russians behind him, calling the invasion a special operation and accusing Ukraine of committing genocide. There has been disinformation online, Russian propaganda on TV, and reports that some Russians have no idea what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine. That is where a group of hackers come in. They are called Anonymous, and they are taking on one of the most powerful men in the world, declaring cyber war against Putin himself and Russia. Correspondent Brian Enton spoke with one of those hackers tonight, and he is joining us live. Brian, there is the war on the ground, and clearly there is another war, and that is of information.
Yeah, Marty, you know, it's really pretty crazy to think about. You've got this group of people, and they are spread out all over the world, and they are working together to take on Putin, and they say they are literally working around the clock. In Ukraine, there is the war on the ground, and then there is the battle happening online. A cyber battle with groups like Anonymous claiming responsibility for major hacks in Russia.
Do you think Anonymous is going to have a real impact on this war?
Yes, I think Anonymous already has. In the last 24 hours, the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situations website has been offline. The Kremlin was infiltrated again. And another 80 gigabytes of emails from a Russian the gas provider have been leaked.
This Anonymous member contacted me through one of the Anonymous Twitter accounts. She says hacking is only a small portion of what the group is doing. They obtained millions of Russian cell phone numbers, and through a secret website, members are texting Russians about the war.
Most of the Russians who respond back to you swear at you. However, you do get people responding back, entering a dialogue. We're sharing photos from the war. We're letting them know that their sons are going to battle, not to train.
Anonymous also has a campaign to post information about the war on Russian Google restaurant reviews. And it's not just Anonymous. Other groups are organizing online to get truthful war information to Russians. One group is even using Tinder to contact people.
This is sort of a new frontier in warfare.
Dr. Leah Blumenfeld, a professor at Barry University, says Putin is trying to control the narrative and is likely caught off guard that everyday people around the world are getting through his wall of secrecy.
It's also a way for people anywhere in the world to assist, to provide information to Russians who only have their state-run media to rely on.
As for Anonymous, they say the hacks continue 24 hours a day.
How can we believe when one hacker says, I did this, and it's all so anonymous? How do we know if someone's taking credit that they really did it? Like with Anonymous, how can we believe it?
That's a really great question. Generally speaking, if someone's taking credit, it's not anonymous. We don't want credit and we don't want money. It's another reason I reached out to you. The Russian propaganda has claimed several times to have arrested Anonymous. And there's clearly that lack of understanding that Anonymous is a hive. You cannot take down the hive. The queen is an idea, it is not a person.
And they really wanted to make that point clear that this is not just one person and that it is people in countries all throughout the world. But here in the United States, even though Russia is an adversary, it is very much illegal. I asked her about that, if it worries her. She says it's a risk they are willing to take. They do feel, though, that the way they go about these things, it's very, very difficult to trace. Marnie?
Wow. Eye-opening and fascinating. Brian, thank you. In a rare public speech, Vladimir Putin pushed his propaganda today even further with his entire nation and also the world watching. Correspondent Evan Lambert now in D.C. with that side of the story and these new developments with his speech.
Marnie, Putin made it sound like everything is going according to the Russian plan, but the White House tonight saying that that rally was one full of misinformation and propaganda. A packed concert in an 80,000-seat stadium in Moscow served as the latest effort in Russian President Vladimir Putin's propaganda machine. On Friday, Putin spoke to a cheering crowd at an event meant to celebrate what the Kremlin calls the 8th anniversary of reunification with Crimea. Much of the rest of the world calls it an illegal annexation. Disinformation researcher Mary Blankenship tells NewsNation Putin's role in this kind of rally is new.
This speech and the rally, I think, is just the cherry on top of the Russian propaganda machine. Facebook, Instagram is blocked, Twitter's partially blocked.
At one point, his speech interrupted on state TV by an abrupt cut to a performance of patriotic songs. The Kremlin saying it was a technical glitch. Elsewhere in Putin's speech, he gave a rosy picture of the state of the Russian army in its war against Ukraine.
The best proof is how our boys are fighting at this special military operation, shoulder to shoulder. They help and support each other. If needed, they cover from bullets on battlefield with their own bodies as if he was their own brother. We didn't see such a unity for a long time.
But a senior U.S. defense official tells NewsNation morale among some Russian units is suffering, a function of, quote, poor leadership, a lack of information about their mission, and disillusionment from fierce Ukrainian resistance. Ukraine says it killed thousands of Russian fighters. There are even unconfirmed reports from Belarusian media that Russian soldiers have turned to shooting themselves with Ukrainian ammunition to make it look like a battle wound so they don't have to fight. The Pentagon saying it's not in a position to comment on those reports. And Marnie, our expert, said that there really is also a generational divide when it comes to how much this disinformation or this propaganda people believe. If people are a little bit older, Russian citizens are a little bit older, then they are more likely to believe that. And we've seen some of that dissent, the protests, mainly among younger Russian citizens. Marnie?
All right, Evan, live in the nation's capital tonight. Evan, thank you. On the ground in Ukraine, this war is widening. Lviv, a major city in western Ukraine, was hit by Russian missile strikes for the first time since the invasion began. Just 50 miles away, of course, is the border of Poland, where the U.S. troops are stationed and also where those 3.3 million refugees are now seeking shelter. Nazar Zinchuk is the executive editor of Lviv Lab, and he is joining us live from Lviv tonight. Let's start there with those explosions in Lviv. For so long, we were hearing kind of a tale of different cities, some that were under siege, others that felt normal, pretty safe. Did that change today?
Actually, it was the second attack on the Lviv region, and for us in Ukraine, it's just the meaning that Putin can hit us everywhere, so the Lviv region is not safe. It's not the place where you can stay and just keep your thoughts with you. You also need to be focused. You also need to remember that this missile was shot from the Azov Sea. It's actually like more than 1,000 kilometers. So this direction is, I can say, it's pretty dangerous that Russia has such missiles and they just can hit each of the regions in Ukraine. So it's very, very dangerous, and that's why Zelenskyy is still speaking about the closure of the sky, because there is no more safety places in Ukraine.
Nazar, I know you're in training right now to join the fight in Kyiv, the capital. Where are you in your preparations, and how soon do you depart?
Now we are still in Lviv. We are still finding some refugees or some foreign military guys who will create one big unit. And actually, I can't say all this information, but because of the consequences of this information.
Of course.
But I'm very glad to see here simple American military guys or European guys, because as we can see from yesterday's Zelenskyy speech in the Council of the USA, it's all gave nothing. So now we just all our speeches to American people, it's also nothing, because nobody's still hearing us, and it's very hesitating. And so everything what you can do now is just come here and help as a simple guy and train here and fight with us side by side, and help all these raped women, all my brothers, my sisters who are dying there every day, every second. Even now, in this moment, I actually think that one more guy has been killed. So we just need to train, to be prepared, and at one moment, I guess this war will be ended. But it's very long time to wait for that.
At one moment, this will end. I hope it's soon. I pray it's soon. Nazar, I want to get your reaction. I don't know if you were just hearing some of our reporting on the propaganda coming out of Russia, the disinformation. I would like to get your thoughts on what Vladimir Putin said today at that rally. 8 years since the annexation of Crimea, he is claiming this is still a military operation to rid the Donbass region of what he says is genocide, rather than what most know and you and I know as a bloodbath and war crimes. When you hear those words from Vladimir Putin, and you're on the ground in Ukraine, and you've been living in this environment for year after year, how does that land with you to hear him say that today?
Actually, I'm just smiling, because it's very funny to hear that. It's so stupid to hear that from the man who must be very clever, who must understand that what he's doing, and everything what he's saying now is just to say his positions, to stay like a president of Russia. And actually, we were hearing this all these 8 years. Now it's just now it hears all the words, and for us it's just a simple his simple words, and it's funny for us because we were listening to all these things for all these 8 years. So we just don't mind about that, because we have another problems, and we just understood that to speak with Russian people now it's not important, because they probably they've been eaten by this propaganda, and they don't care what's happening here.
Nazar, Godspeed to you.
They've got Stingers, but you never hit a missile with a Stinger, but you can hit a helicopter or a low-flying aircraft. They are also being supplied with a number of other of the shorter-range anti-aircraft batteries. What they have been asking for in the past is stuff similar to Israel's Iron Dome. Israel has resisted sending Iron Dome here in the past. I'm not sure where they stand at the moment, but this is clearly it is helping to keep the center of Kyiv safe at the same time. And it's very interesting what Nick's been reporting there about the battle for Mykolaiv and down to Kherson, because the Ukrainian armed forces here in the capital are saying that they are having similar successes in terms of a counter-offensive against the Russian invaders in the southwest of the city, the west, and particularly in the east, claiming that they pushed them in the east back 70 kilometers. That puts this, where I'm standing here, out of range of all of Russia's normal, traditional artillery, but in range, obviously, of the longer range missile systems such as Iskander and others. And those deliver these very, very big warheads. Some of them are smart, but some of them are very, very dangerous in that they have simply fired in a general direction. And I think we're likely to see more of that, as Nick was also saying, where he is down in the south.
And Nick, if you could just talk a little bit about the theater that was struck, how many people have so far been pulled out, and what do we know about, I mean, what are the capabilities for them to actually keep digging through the wreckage.
I mean, I wish I could tell you more, to be honest, but in Mariupol, to the other side of, absolutely, the other side of the Crimea Peninsula, further east of where I'm standing here in Mykolaiv, you referring to that airstrike that hit the drama theatre, an established, well-known bomb shelter. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy saying, look, at this stage, 130 people have been pulled or helped out of the rubble there as survivors. The problem is that there were thought to have been over 1,000 there when the bomb struck, and that's backed up by video shot or posted 6 days before that rather barbaric attack, showing women and children crammed into very dense and dark conditions there, sharing what food they could have. And so we are still now 2 days later, because of the difficulties that rescuers have, frankly, in the number of rescuers available to the task, and the fact that that task is impeded by intense shelling around there. We are still unclear as to how many people were in that bomb shelter, how many survived, how many have been brought out. It's 130 that we know of, but hopefully that figure has grown in recent hours. And so still that utterly chilling attack is lacking basic information because of the circumstances in which it occurred, Anderson. Obviously the priority of rescue is getting people out, not tallying who unfortunately remains in these circumstances. But satellite images showing the damage done to Mariupol and a lengthy queue of cars trying to get out as these humanitarian corridors struggle to do anything positive for those stuck in there in such fraught circumstances. Anderson.
Yeah, Nick Payton-Walsh, Sam Kiley, Caitlin Collins, appreciate it all. Thank you. Coming up next, a CNN exclusive. We saw Russian forces grab him, the kidnap caught on security cameras. We reported on his release in a prisoner swap. Tonight, my conversation with the mayor of Melitopol.
That's not all it takes. They struggle for us to be free from the psycho in this human family. Ireland's sorrow and pain is now the Ukraine, and St. Patrick's name is now Zelenskyy.
Well, she's lost touch a little bit. I don't think that's overstatement. But you have to wonder when.
Really seems to know where China stands when it comes to the war in Ukraine. But President Biden tried to make one thing clear today, that if China helps Russia in any way, there would be significant repercussions. A 2-hour phone call between Biden and China's leader, Xi Jinping, was part of an urgent effort by the U.S. to prevent China from making any sort of deal with Russia as America and its allies try to shut down Moscow's financial lifelines. Correspondent Kelly Meyer joining us tonight from the White House with the details. Kelly.
Good evening, Marty. Well, we still don't know if Biden's warning got across to the Chinese leader. Reporters trying to ask the White House today what kind of assurances they got that Xi wasn't going to be helping Moscow. Their response was, "You'll have to ask Beijing."
Tonight, a warning to China's leader, help Russia and face the consequences.
That is something we will be watching and the world will be watching.
In a 2-hour phone call, President Joe Biden warning Chinese President Xi Jinping of what's ahead should they help Moscow with its invasion of Ukraine. In a readout given by the White House after the call, Biden described the implications and consequences if China provides material support to Russia as it conducts brutal attacks against Ukrainian cities and civilians. Punishment could include severe sanctions against the world's largest exporter. The White House saying Biden laid out the implications not only for the U.S. and China, but the entire world. According to the readout of the call from Chinese officials, the two presidents had a candid and in-depth exchange of views on China-U.S. relations. Xi saying he doesn't want to see the situation in Ukraine come to this, saying China stands for peace and opposes war. But Xi has yet to denounce Russia for its deadly invasion. The fear is that China could supply Russia with the weapons and military support as Putin continues to suffer losses. The White House says the choice is China's to make.
China has to make a decision for themselves about where they want to stand and how they want the history books to look at them and view their actions.
Whether Biden's direct appeal to his Chinese counterpart today worked remains to be seen.
And today, Xi called for Russia and Ukraine to continue negotiations. He also suggested that the U.S. and NATO talk directly to Russia to try to defuse the situation. Marnie?
All right, Kelly, thank you. The UN puts the number of refugees fleeing
Nugati Station. Okay.
Good luck.
Once again, Russia has attacked civilians here in Kyiv, bombing an apartment complex, killing at least one person here, wounding more than a dozen. But if you look at the scale of the attack, the bomb landed right in the middle of this complex, damaging all the apartments around, also a school, a supermarket, a kindergarten. The death toll could have been far worse. And this is happening every day now, not just in Kyiv, but also in Kharkiv, in Mariupol, in Chernihiv, where civilians are being attacked without any military targets in the area.
That was NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel from the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. This entire week, we've been seeing this kind of reporting from those on the ground. Russian forces apparently deliberately targeting civilian areas, whatever it is, apartment buildings, schools, hospitals. It's a similar pattern we've seen in other eastern and central Ukrainian cities. Now today, for the first time in the 3-week-long war, Russian missiles hit Lviv in western Ukraine, just 40 miles from Poland. They struck an aircraft repair facility near the airport. And it is a dramatic step up in the war, a stark example to Ukrainians that no place may be safe. NBC News correspondent Cal Perry is in Lviv. He joins me now live with the latest. Cal, my understanding is you guys heard some explosions just about an hour ago. What's the latest there?
Yeah, and look, this is a city that is under martial law and under a curfew, so unless I can see it from my location here in the balcony, we're probably not going to have more information on it until the morning. The other thing that's going on here is the government is being very vague intentionally about these targets, about what is being hit. So it's intentionally vague what you're saying, airport repair facility. We know it's somewhere near the airport. Journalists were not allowed near the scene. And again, that is an operational security issue for a city that is preparing itself for potentially further airstrikes. It is the generalization of that information that is very purposeful on behalf of the authorities here in the western part of the country. This is about supply lines as well, of course. The Russians have said they will target anything that they view as a supply line. That's very possible that that's what that was earlier this morning. To the east of the country, as you've been laying out, we continue to see these civilian areas under heavy bombardment. What was maybe a week ago the indiscriminate targeting of civilians has now slowly moved into the direct targeting, certainly of civilians as they leave these areas. We've been talking towns like Zaporizhia, north of Mariupol, where civilians today, for example, 5,000 were able to get out, people going to Zaporizhia, and then the Russian military is targeting those intersections. As you heard from Richard Engel, what we've seen in the last 24 hours is a direct targeting of the lifelines that civilians rely on, the food structures. In Chernihiv, for example, a bread line targeted by Russian troops. In Kyiv, it is that grain facility that was targeted by Russian troops. In Kharkiv, it was a marketplace targeted by Russian forces. So you see the slow disintegration of what remains of a structure that would support civilians. The worst of it seems to be in Mariupol, where, again, we're talking about civilians who can't even get above ground long enough to bury loved ones. A city that is now being defined by images of these mass graves. It is something that is unimaginable until you sort of see it, and we're starting to now get pictures from inside these places that we just haven't seen. The video you're seeing on the right side of your screen was taken earlier today. This is the first look that we're getting at this neighborhood, where again we're seeing sort of makeshift graves above grounds in these apartment areas, places where no one should have to bury a loved one, and that's what we're seeing play out on the ground, Chris.
Quickly, Cal, I just want to ask you about the mood in Lviv. I mean, I know the city is tense, it's on edge. There are many internally displaced Ukrainians who are sheltering there because it's been out of the line of fire, at least up until now. What are things like in the streets of Lviv, as it seems inevitable that what has happened to Kyiv will be turned loose on Lviv?
Yeah, I think people are coming to that realization, and I think it's taken the airstrike that we saw this morning to see the doubling, for example, of sandbags. It's not just the government facilities, the police stations, the government center. It is also historical locations. A 300-year-old church I walked past this evening on my way to try to grab some food, and they've sandbagged, double sandbag all of those windows that are on ground level, any of those stained glass windows. Statues, for the third time since World War I, World War II, and now again in the year 2022, II being wrapped up, prepared to maybe be moved underground. So it is a European city that is preparing for possible air assault, and we see that on the streets here.
All right, Cal Perry, as always, thank you and stay safe. We really appreciate the work you're doing. Thank you very much. Yeah. I want to now turn to Karun Demirjian. She is a Pentagon correspondent with the Washington Post. She was also a Moscow correspondent during the invasion of Crimea back in 2014, and she joins me now. Karun, I guess the first question is, we saw that that big package of military aid that was announced yesterday, of Stinger missiles and ammo, body armor, a whole bunch of stuff. What is the Pentagon, obviously they're not going to say much about this in a specific granular terms, because they don't want it intercepted, but is there a sense of how quickly and expeditiously that can get provided to Ukrainian fighters?
It can be sent out, provided that it exists in the United States stores, which there are supplies. And look, we saw in the last tranche of aid that went, military assistance that went out, that it happened fairly quickly. That was a $350 billion package. You saw at least $240 million going out within about a little bit more than a week. And so that is gives you a sense of how urgent this is. So the United States clearly is going to try to get things to Ukraine as fast as possible. There's also moves by various other NATO countries to try to do the same. You listed the package of U.S.-sponsored material that's going over there, all of which is kind of augmenting the supply that we've already been sending to Ukraine and sending them more of that. So those are things that have been utilized on the battlefield. They show that it's surface-to-air missiles, preparation for potential urban warfare in some ways. You'd have to assume based on the smaller arms. But this isn't the whole scope of the negotiation, obviously. As you know, there's been a lot of tension this week in talking about how to get surface-to-air missile systems to the Ukrainians that would have longer range and be able to hit Russian warplanes at higher altitude. And obviously Zelenskyy has been pleading with many countries around the world, many allied countries, to send him at least those, if not planes, if not helping him close the skies over the country.
Yeah, it seems like the sort of structure of the Zelenskyy ask, both in the U.S., before the U.S. Congress earlier this week, and before the German government as well, was a kind of, a high ask, which I think he knew he wasn't get, which was a no-fly zone, which is difficult and dangerous for a whole bunch of reasons, and then a sort of, a fallback ask that he seemed more confident in getting, and it does seem like those requests for military equipment are coming through.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a smart negotiation tactic to ask for more than you think you're going to get, and also to kind of go around people like President Biden and appeal directly to Congress or directly to parliaments to put that upward pressure on the administration to do more and do more faster. As you pointed out, the tippy-top request that he's got, the no-fly zone, at least President Biden has been pretty clear that that is not going to happen. NATO, too, they don't want to get into a head-to-head confrontation with Russia, and it would require you to shoot down Russian warplanes if you're going to enforce this based on the way Russia has been operating. And there's also similar resistance, at least in the United States, to sending MiGs and things like that, because they don't think they'll be able to stay up in the sky very long, because the Russians have positioned surface-to-air missile systems too that pretty much blanket the entire country. So it's dangerous. It's possible, but it's a dangerous undertaking and not great odds of being able to actually hit targets before the Ukrainians would lose those assets too. So that's why we've focused where we have, and that's the middle ground between what Zelenskyy has been vocalizing and what the West has seemingly been willing to do.
Since you were a Moscow bureau chief, you were a correspondent in Moscow during the annexation of Crimea in 2014, that rally today, which I don't know if we noted up top, was ostensibly a sort of memorialization and celebration of the Crimea annexation, more than explicitly this particular special military operation. And I guess I wonder, just at a personal level, like, you think about yourself back in 2014 covering that, did you see this day coming?
Well, I mean, most of my experience in Ukraine was during the Donbass side of the war, but look, Crimea has been a very pivotal episode for the Russian people and for the Ukrainian people. That was a fairly bloodless annexation of a large piece of Ukrainian territory that happened by a referendum that's been internationally condemned, but it happened. And Ukraine has not been willing to recognize that, neither has the West, but we've kind of hit this point where, we're in a de facto state of Ukraine, Kyiv specifically, not having control over these areas that have either been annexed by Russia or the separatist self-declared republics that are in the east, in Donetsk and Luhansk. And so, the Russians, Putin specifically, taking this moment to celebrate that, to point out it's been 8 years, that's not accidental. He's trying to build sympathies at home and he's trying to paint the Russian side as the victim here, in the face of Western aggression and Ukrainian aggression and all of these things that are very, very spun up, very, very trumped up sort of lines that he's selling to his own people. But that's the argument he's making, and Crimea is kind of, the origin point of that for when Putin started scoring wins.
Yeah, and your point there about the sort of bloodlessness of it, I think is well taken, because I think to the extent that there's calculations from Putin about the ease he would face here, we know that they thought this would go much easier than it had been, and they had a little bit of sort of proof of concept in how it went in Crimea in terms of the amount of fighting there and the duration of that operation. Karun Demirjian, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Next, President Biden tries to prevent China from providing any assistance to Putin's war. What we know about his nearly 2-hour-long conversation with Xi Jinping after this.
All day. Why not put a little spring in your step? It's time to try WeatherTech's new
skin and noticeably less itch.
With at least one heart disease risk factor have higher risks. Don't take if allergic to Rinvoq.
Distinct and separate from possible violations of the prohibition against the development and production of biological weapons, if we wish to preserve the Biological Weapons Convention regime. Research into new and dangerous pathogens should be subject to strict transparency mechanisms. Finally, I would like to reiterate what we said last week. Brazil condemns in the strongest possible terms the use or threat of use of all weapons of mass destruction, including biological and chemical weapons, anywhere, by anyone, under any circumstances. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement and give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. We join others in expressing our deepest condolences to the mission of Ireland and the family of Ambassador Jim Kelly over his shocking demise. I thank Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, Under-Secretary General and High Representative of Disarmament Affairs, for her briefing. Mr. President, it is regrettable that the armed conflict in Ukraine rages on at an intolerable cost to the people of Ukraine, and increasingly to the entire world, especially the Global South, as prices of essential commodities rise sharply because of shortages and the impacts of sanctions. We are gravely concerned by the sustained targeting of civilians and objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, including residential homes, health facilities, shelters, as well as power and water infrastructure, in violation of international law and international humanitarian law. At this point, Mr. President, this Council should be focused on getting a cessation of the military campaign in Ukraine. We appeal to the concerned to do so immediately to allow humanitarian action and facilitate a much-needed dialogue towards a sustainable political solution. Any allegation of the development of biological weapons in contravention of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, and Stockpiling of Biological Weapons must not be taken lightly. We call on all state parties to the Convention to make use of the established mechanisms so that any concern or suspicion of the presence of these extremely dangerous weapons can be verified. In situations of armed conflict, we must point out that such verifications demand a cessation of the conflict for it to be carried out. We urge state parties to the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, and Stockpiling of Biological Weapons to seize the opportunity of the 9th Review Conference later this year to strengthen the biological weapons regime. In closing, Mr. President, Kenya reaffirms its recognition of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for her statement and give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. Let me also express our deepest condolences to the Irish mission for the very sad passing of our dear colleague, Jim Kelly. At the outset, thanks to the High Representative Nakamitsu for your briefing. We were called here today at the request of the Russian delegation to again discuss claims of a biological weapons program in Ukraine. Yet, we heard from the High Representative last week, and it was repeated today, and I quote, "The United Nations is not aware of any biological weapon programs in Ukraine." Russia has failed to offer any credible evidence for its claims, providing us instead with unsubstantiated information, allegation, and interpretations. We have trouble understanding the rationale behind the last-minute call to have further discussions today. We find it unacceptable that Russia continues to repeat its unsupported claims that Ukraine is preparing to use biological weapons. It is becoming quite clear that this is just another smokescreen tactic to draw attention away from Russia's role as aggressor in this illegal invasion of Ukraine. President, Norway remains a firm supporter of the Biological Weapons Convention, and we are determined, together with parameters in the international community, together with partners in the international community, to uphold a total ban against biological weapons. Norway condemns any use of such weapons. They cannot and must not be used under any circumstances. This would constitute a clear violation of international law. We deeply regret that Russia, by calling these meetings, seeks to undermine this council and its vital role to peace diplomacy. Exactly 8 years ago, we were shocked by the Russian illegal annexation of Crimea. And now, Russia is waging an unlawful war against another UN member state with devastating humanitarian consequences. The sole responsibility for the war falls on Russia. Russia must end it now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement and give the
about trans people. I really don't. I think this is all an effort to, what's the word, to troll us, to humiliate us, to force us to accept something everybody watching knows is false, because when they do that, they subdue us.
Basically along these lines, that number one, he presides over a government which has been seeking to use its relationship with Russia to give it as much latitude as possible to expand its regional and global assertiveness against the United States. That's the first point. I think the second is that the Chinese and the Russians in the UN Security Council collaborate on all manner of things, whether it's from the Middle East to other trouble spots in the world. And again, there's a concerted challenge to the US-led international system. And finally, there's something of what I describe as a Xi Jinping-Vladimir Putin bromance, reflected in the photographs currently on your screen, which is these authoritarian hard men with a common view that they are, quote, men of history, and seeking to roll back the tide of the American-dominated liberal international order. Put all that together, that's where the Chinese are coming from. I think what the United States in this most recent exchange today between President Biden and President Xi Jinping was trying to articulate clearly was, if China decides to provide material financial or material military support to Putin's Russia at this time for use in Ukraine, then this will invite an American reaction to China. And that is the core communication which I think President Biden sought to deliver. I think the message has been received. The open question is, what will China do in the weeks ahead to on these two questions.
Yeah, just to the background here of some of those photos, 20 days before the invasion, there was this big announcement between the two countries that they had a friendship that has no limits, a phrase which can't help but be funny to me. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation, nothing taboo apparently between the two. The two countries said in a joint statement. I have to say, I would love your wisdom and experience here. So the U.S. keeps saying, look, there's reports that Russia has asked explicitly for essentially rearmament from the Chinese. And the U.S. has said publicly they think that's the case and they fear the warning against it. It does seem to me like that would be a very proactive and provocative step by the Chinese and unnecessary. I guess I don't understand the upside for them in something going that far. How realistic do you think that is?
Beijing, to some extent, is divided on these questions. I mean, I've spent the better part of 30 or 40 years rolling my head around these questions in one form or another, back to when I was a junior woodchuck in the Australian Foreign Service, serving in our embassy in Beijing way back when, and looking at the prism of Russia-China relations ever since. You see, I think the bottom line is that Xi Jinping has a view of Putin that they have a common cause against the United States, which represents a force multiplier for China's global diplomatic project and its regional efforts, even in Asia, to roll back the US-dominated order. And furthermore, what Russia does by virtue of its actions in Syria and in Europe, like in Ukraine, is it diverts American attention. It diverts the strategic focus of the United States away from the China challenge. So for those reasons, Xi has an enormous attachment to keeping Putin and Putin's Russia operational. I know the counter-arguments, which is the Europeans, historically fairly benign towards China, are now seeing China through a different lens. Secondly, the international community and the developing world is now voting against the Russian invasion, despite China sitting to the sidelines. And on top of that, there's always this danger that what Putin is doing, in fact, invites American financial sanctions down on China's head, and what I would describe as the Armageddon option. And all those things act against China's material interests, but never underestimate that for a Marxist-Leninist regime like the one in Beijing, politics and security always come first and they trump economics. And that's the dangerous zone that we're in.
All right. That was really illuminating. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, now the head of the Asia Society. Thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
Coming up, Congressman Cawthorn's Putin-friendly comments have earned him a spot.
Following this tragedy out of Texas and is live once again with us tonight. Marky, I know a lot of people have asked, they're wondering how a teen, 13 years old, ends up behind the wheel.
Yeah, Marnie, depending on who you ask, this is really getting met with mixed emotions. Some people are shocked, other people not so surprised. And I'll tell you this, I grew up in Texas and Oklahoma. It is not abnormal in those rural communities, illegal and wrong, but not abnormal to see young kids who aren't even old enough to have a driver's license get behind the wheel. And law enforcement that I talked to today say this is something they see on a weekly basis.
A 13-year-old child was behind the wheel of the pickup truck.
It's the devastating update out of West Texas. A young boy behind the wheel of the pickup truck that collided with the University of the Southwest golf team, killing 9 people. But in rural communities, similar to where the crash happened, it's not uncommon for children younger than 16 to drive.
We see it all the time, especially in the rural places, but even in the metro areas.
Trooper Eric Foster is with Oklahoma Highway Patrol. He's worked city and country roads there for 10 years.
I would estimate, by looking at numbers, I would estimate that we see probably an underage driver several times a week.
He underscores that underage driving is wrong and illegal. But in this part of the world, especially where some kids as young as 14 can get special permits to drive during harvest season, the practice isn't abnormal.
In this part of the world that is agriculture, it's very vast. It's wide open spaces. To see that is not necessarily shocking.
Car crashes are the #1 cause of death for teens living in the United States.
In Texas, Daniel Armbruster teaches teen driver safety classes for AAA. He stresses with so many factors, including speed, nighttime, and a spare tire, the child shouldn't have been behind the wheel at all.
Not only is it illegal, it's extremely dangerous to operate a motor vehicle or have a young child operating a motor vehicle. In Texas, you can't even get a provisional license or a learner's permit until you're 15 years old. And there's good reason for that. It's because you're not mature enough.
Censorship remains. But it's kind of strange that they come out of nowhere in the middle of this war fever to tell us that. Politico, for example, said this: Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinformation, dozens of former intel officials say. That's what they told us last year. They haven't corrected it. Neither has Joe Biden. He used that report to dismiss the story on the debate stage. In case you've forgotten, here it is.
We are in a situation where
Ukraine, Zelenskyy does and knows the importance of keeping the population united and motivated.
The Russian president, if I were to hazard a guess, is all in. He's been all in from the beginning, and he's drawn deep. There is no negotiation right now that looks acceptable. It's weakness. His forces are bogged down. Like a riverboat gambler, I think that he may again to try to pull down even more formations, even more formations coming in, more redoubled artillery, more rockets, though a lot of the precision munitions are gone. So this is grim, and this is awful for the Ukrainians. But there's almost as if there's a mutual stranglehold going on right now, and the Ukrainians have got the Russians held as tightly as the Russians are trying to hold them, and the Russians are breaking, and the morale is there, and they're going to try the firepower. And yes, they're talking about Russian reinforcements. We have a term called reinforcing failure in the military, and the word, Anderson, is getting out back into the Russian ranks, up back into Russia, formations maybe getting prepared. Where are all the wounded going? Which is a whole, they're usually double or triple the wounded to those that have died in combat. So there's a lot going on right now. Ukrainians to have the Russians in a stranglehold, as ugly as it is, and they're going to hang on because, as General Hertling mentioned, they've got the will, they've got the motivation and the morale, and the Russians have none of that.
General Hertling, do we know much about, I mean, you talk about the wounded, it's not something we focused much on either side of the conflict. You know, in the U.S. military, there's this focus on the golden hour, on getting somebody who's wounded off the battlefield and medical care within that hour, and that's essential. I mean, Russia, they don't have those capabilities, do they?
They do not. And they, as we've talked about so many times, Anderson, the logistics train is absolutely horrid in the Russian assault. They have not planned for the kind of activity, this so-called battle of annihilation, with 6 different axes of advance. You have to support each one of those. You know, you've got to do it with food and fuel and ammo. The one thing we haven't talked about is medical evacuation. They can't bring wounded soldiers back to combat support hospitals either by trucks, because the trucks are stuck in those 40-mile convoys that are now being picked off. They also can't use aircraft like medevac helicopters to transport them back, because Ukraine has been so successful in knocking down helicopters with Stinger missiles. So what you're probably going to see is the wounded that do get back are in really bad shape, and somehow were prioritized. But what I'm going to suggest, Anderson, is, I hate to bring it down to these gory details, but medical professionals in the military actually calculate the number of wounded soldiers versus killed soldiers on a conventional tank battlefield like this. If you can get a wounded soldier back to the aid stations, they have a 20% chance of dying and a 80% chance of living. The Russians are not getting soldiers back. So the wounds to dead ratio in the Russian force is going to skyrocket. It's probably going to be 1 to 2. Even minor injuries on the battlefield, minor wounds on the battlefield are going to cause death on those Russian soldiers. There are not going to be a lot of hospitals, in my view, filled with Russian soldiers at the end of this, because most of them will have been wounded and then died on the battlefield or outright killed. It's just horrific, the kinds of casualties both forces are suffering, but I would suggest the Russian forces are suffering much more because they are more visible and prone to these attacks by a Ukrainian hasty offense. Hasty defense.
I mean, in this way, it's like war from another century. General Hertling, General Zwack, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Coming up, new video of 2 former U.S. presidents, their extraordinary gesture of support for Ukraine. And we'll speak with an American doctor whose team is risking their lives to treat Ukrainians, not just on the border when they flee, but also inside the country.
Wonderful pistachios.
Cubans or Mexican Americans who turned conservative, then they wouldn't want an open border. You know, it's a lot like energy and gas prices. They got their wish. They had 14 months. They destroyed things, and they know the solution: pump more oil, you know, print less money, but they can't do it because that solution is worse than the disease. So they say things like, you know, have volunteers at the border, take the bus. The oil companies are doing anything but the solution, because they're ideologues that the only thing they care about is power. That's all. They don't care about people. It's just power and the retention of power.
So Hispanics are pushing them to close the border. Can we just take 2 seconds to acknowledge how amusing and great that is?
Ask your doctor about everyday Verzenio.
Next on Dan Abrams Live.
It's the hottest seller's market in years. If you're thinking of selling your home, your first...
And
that's
so
that's
exactly
they don't,
I know they're ideologues, but I meant by that their ideology is power. And they change their politics in any other direction they need to retain power. They sent Cubans back as soon as they started coming in numbers. And if Russians started coming across the border, Tucker, they...
The Russian propaganda, but reply to the questions that we asked. You're refusing to do so. Simply because you've got nothing to say. Rather than this, you're trying to accuse us of intention to deploy biological and chemical weapons against Ukraine. This is real cynicism, isn't it? We've already warned about the fact that we know, and we officially warned that we do know, and we do have information about Ukrainian nationalists using chemical agents in some regions to carry out a provocation and then accuse Russia of having done it. This is a false flag operation. I say that we didn't listen to us properly, particularly the US. We didn't say, as the representative of the US claimed, that Ukraine itself has a military biological program. This program, we said, based on the documents that we have, is something that the US itself has, not Ukraine. And Ukraine, in this case, is being kept in the dark. And we already provided you with facts, talked you through them, about the spike in Ukraine of dangerous, lethal diseases, which there's no explanation for them with usual factors. They can't explain that. It could be linked to this kind of activity, though. Today, again, we heard the argument that the biggest argument of proof that in Ukraine there are no biological activities being taken place is the view, and the main, this was the UN Secretariat view, but I already said that the UN can't know about this. Secret military biological programs and those who carry them out are not shared with the UN or with anybody else. And as I already said, and I said before, we put this item on the agenda. New facts have appeared, and we will keep the Security Council abreast, as well as the international community, about these facts, which will be, I'm sure, revealed in the near future. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation.
To choose the plan?
It's like nothing but hard calls. Like what?
Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush went to a Ukrainian church in Chicago. They wore blue and yellow ribbons, and they each brought bouquets of bright yellow sunflowers, leaving them at the church in a show of solidarity with the Ukrainian people and with their fight. Chicago, you may know, is a sister city to Kyiv, and tonight here in Eastern Europe, a South Florida doctor is leading a medical team racing to save Ukrainians, either by caring for them once they cross the border into Moldova or risking their own safety by going into Ukraine to try to help them. They even bought an ambulance to help. Dr. Zev Newworth leads the United Hatzalah medical team. He joins me tonight. Dr. Newworth, can you just tell us a little bit about your decision to come to Moldova and do whatever you could to help?
Well, I wouldn't exactly call it a decision. It was more like a call to action. When you're sitting back home in your comfort of your home and your environment, and you see people anywhere literally crying out in pain, and you see the pain, the suffering, I wouldn't be able to just sit and do nothing.
You've set up along the border in Moldova, but you're actually going in and have teams going into Ukraine in order to get people who are unable to get over the border themselves and who may have medical needs. How did you decide to do that?
There was a large segment that we were starting to learn of individuals that weren't able to make it to the borders, the people that weren't able to make it to the buses, the train stations, or who had any type of modality of being able to exit. And these were individuals that we understood were the elderly, the frail, the sick, the injured. And at that time, it was made a conscious decision that we actually have to go in and help these individuals. So with that, put together a small team. So it was myself, a couple paramedics, and we went in there basically from word of mouth saying we have some individuals in this and this location, they're sick or they've been injured, and we'd go in and initially assess, stabilize, treat, and do an exfil and extricate them back to the borders where United Hatzalah would pick up and continue ongoing care and provide any additional resources available to them.
Have you ever worked in a situation like this?
I have been exposed to similar situations in the past, and each one is unique in its own right. This in particular is not just dealing with the mass of people that are exiting and the wounded, of course, the destruction that you see, but these people have literally left their homes with just the shirts on their back. So aside from injuries, you're talking about people with chronic medical conditions, for example, whether it's high blood pressure, diabetes, dealing with some type of infectious process, and they're leaving with no meds, no money. And of course, we know that if these situations aren't properly controlled and regulated, they'll turn into an acute medical emergency relatively quickly. And now, given the situation of what's going on inside Ukraine with limited amount of resources and especially medications, these stable conditions are no longer stable. So we need to get to them and help them as soon as possible. And that kind of what makes this situation a little bit more unique than others.
I hope it's okay if I ask you a personal question, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but I read that you used to be a businessman and that you suffered a very tragic loss of your wife through brain cancer, and at a relatively late age in your 40s decided to pursue the dream you'd always had. You'd been, I think, a paramedic on your spare time, but you went to medical school and became a doctor. It's such an extraordinary thing to have done. Do you ever have any regrets?
None whatsoever. I mean, when we experience, unfortunately, loss of that magnitude, sometimes you take a step back and you start reflecting upon your own life. And it was important for me to wake up every morning and absolutely love what I was doing. Had a long time childhood dream of I always want to be a doctor when I grow up, and life had its own course, and I was grateful to have a beautiful marriage with my late wife and raised 4 beautiful children and had a successful business. But I felt my true calling was other than that. And I made that conscious decision that I don't want to be, God forbid, on my deathbed going, I only wish I followed my dreams of becoming a physician. And when she passed, I picked up my 4 kids and got accepted to medical school and continued on that path. Growing up as well, there was another passion. And of course, a lot of little kids, you know, they grow up, they want to be policemen, firemen. I wanted to be a soldier. And after completing medical school, I was grateful for everything that I had. And one of my ways of being able to give back was to serve my country. And it was an honor in doing so. And I got commissioned as a U.S. naval officer and proudly served. Very honored to have been able to do that. So I think it's important that in life, and we realize that life is really, really short. 1, it's never too late. And 2, always follow your dreams. And just seeing what's going on over here, the destruction of this magnitude, about the dreams, just being ripped away, the loss, the sorrow, the pain, the suffering. You just can't sit by idly. I became a doctor to help those in need. I've had a calling to always be there to somehow help ease pain and suffering. It was a no-brainer.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you're there, and I appreciate you talking to us tonight. And to be able to have the skills and be able to save people's lives and help people is an extraordinary thing. Thank you, Dr. Neuwirth. I appreciate it.
Absolute honor, and thank you.
What a wonderful person. Coming up, a look at what we know about Vladimir Putin's inner circle, who is advising him, and who, if anyone, he actually trusts. Plus, a conversation with Fareed Zakaria about President Biden's conversation with China's President Xi. That's ahead.
One person can.
As Putin desperately looks for a way to save face. And meanwhile, back at home in Moscow, Putin is facing more humiliation. Russia's currency has now crashed. Moscow's stock market has been shut down for weeks. Anti-war protests have erupted all over the country. And today, during a big manufactured pro-Putin rally in Moscow, his best attempt to look like Donald Trump, there were some embarrassing technical difficulties during Vladimir's big speech. Take a look.
Совпало, совершенно случайно совпало с днем рождения одного из наших выдающихся военных.
Oops, Vladimir Putin can't get through his speech without screwing that up. Kind of like Joe Biden. Anyway, according to reports, the stadium was filled with thousands of government workers who were required to attend. Unlike a Trump rally, anyone in Russia who voices opposition to Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, they're thrown in jail. Vladimir Putin is not in a good place, and right now the world is facing an extremely dangerous and critical tipping point. And what happens in Russia and Ukraine will have reverberations all over the world. But guess what? Our fearless leader, Joe Biden, he's taking another weekend in Delaware. A lot of ice cream, a lot of nap time. And before heading out, Joe did have a call with China's president, President Xi, to discuss Ukraine and other issues of mutual concern.
Counteroffensive has pushed Russian forces back, so much so that miraculously, residents are attempting some sort of a return to normal life. Coffee shops, restaurants, bank branches have reopened. Buses and trams are operating. The local flower shop says business is good because Ukrainian soldiers are buying flowers. Supermarkets have even managed to restock. Residents are grocery shopping. Now, of course, the question is, how long can this last? And with Russia increasingly resorting to air power to pummel Ukraine's cities, a moment of peace can be shattered in an instant anywhere in the city, anywhere in the country, really. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel filed this report from Kyiv this evening.
A missile exploded here in Kyiv around 8 a.m. this morning. No military targets anywhere in sight, just apartments, a kindergarten, an elementary school, and a grocery. An entire community devastated in a split second.
Attacking apartment complexes like this is a terror campaign to frighten Ukrainians into surrendering. But it's not working. And all the damage here and across this country is only convincing Ukrainians of the need to fight even harder or lose everything. In front of her building, Natalia was having a first cup of coffee when suddenly her window exploded into shards. Everything started crumbling. I felt the shockwave and I fell on the floor, she says. But even covered in iodine for all the cuts, she's optimistic. Our wonderful boys and girls are fighting and we will win. Our enemies, those damned occupiers, say we have some Nazism here. I don't understand what's happening in those brains of theirs.
Those wild accusations of Nazism in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin was pushing them once again at this scene, this giant scene in Moscow today. Putin was making his first public appearance since he launched his invasion of Ukraine over 3 weeks ago. Tens of thousands of people packed into Moscow's largest stadium for Putin's speech, though there were local reports that many of them were state workers who were bussed in under orders from their bosses. The event was held to mark the 8-year anniversary of Russia's seizure of Crimea, and Putin used it to further his claims that he is liberating Ukraine from its genocidal Nazi leaders, which is as nutty as it sounds. Today at the United Nations, the U.S. ambassador to the UN took a swipe at Russia's increasingly paranoid conspiratorial pronouncements.
Last week, we heard from the Russian representative a tirade of bizarre conspiracy theories. This week, we're hearing a whole lot more where that came from. Things that sound like they were forwarded to him on a chain email from some dark corner of the internet. President Biden has a word for this kind of talk: malarkey.
But full of malarkey though they may be, today the Kremlin demonstrated that nowhere in Ukraine is beyond its reach, at least from the skies. Black smoke rose over the western Ukrainian city of Lviv today after Russian missiles struck an aircraft repair plant there. Lviv, it's just 50 miles from Poland. It's gone largely untouched thus far in the invasion. It's been a hub for refugees who've been fleeing the eastern part of the country and for humanitarian supplies coming in. And just tonight, more large explosions have been heard in Lviv. Joining us now again from Lviv is NBC News' Cal Perry. My friend, you have heard some loud booms where you are not long ago. What's the situation in Lviv?
It's unclear, and to be, honest, and we'll pull back the curtain for our viewers, this is a city that is not only under martial law, but it is also under curfew. So there's no moving around at night. There's no way to check it out. And the government here also doesn't want to give the Russians any more information than they absolutely need to. So the strikes this morning were put to us as strikes, quote unquote, near the airport sort of complex. Because again, the government here doesn't want to let the Russians know that they were successful in hitting targets. There were initially 6 cruise missiles fired at that target you're seeing on the left side of your screen. Air defenses knocked 2 of those missiles out. I share that information because it's quite possible the booms that we heard about 90 minutes ago, almost 2 hours, that those could have been air defenses, Ali.
Are there concerns amongst the people in Lviv of the war spreading to the western part of the country? Because that's where people went. In fact, there was some thought about how even Vladimir Zelenskyy would be evacuated to Lviv to be able to conduct the affairs of the government there. Is there concern that this war is spreading west?
So there's not only concern, but there's preparations for it. And the preparations we're seeing on the ground are for a widened and a further air campaign by the Russians. So we're seeing a doubling up, for example, of sandbags. It's not just the government facilities, though those do seem to be sort of braced and ready for attacks: police stations, fire stations, government centers. It is also cultural things in this city: statues, paintings. We've seen churches, 300-400-year-old churches, have sandbagged, there it is right there on the left side of your screen, have sandbagged the windows that are at street level. They're worried about some of these very famous windows, some of these stained glass windows that are, as I said, 300-400 years old. So it is a city that is preparing for an intensified air campaign. You still have, as you've made it abundantly clear, this human traffic, this flow of refugees coming from places like Mariupol, where we're seeing just incredibly incredibly gruesome pictures of civilians trapped in basements, only making it outside for a few hours at best, like every third day, these mass graves. That is what people are fleeing. And the renewed airstrikes, Ali, the airstrikes yesterday morning, the booms that I heard a few hours ago, this is only going to spur people who may have decided to settle here in Lviv, people who found a place to stay with friends, with family, or who found empty rooms in the dormitory. This is only going to spur on a second wave of refugees, a second wave of internally displaced people. And we're talking again about over 3 million people have already left this country, 13 million people in immediate need. And we know, Ali, that as these bombings continue, as this air campaign widens, those numbers are only going to grow.
All right, Cal, I know that you and your team know your way around this sort of thing. You've been doing it for a long time, but I am worried about you. Stay safe, my friend. Cal Perry in Lviv. We'll continue to stay in touch with Cal as the develops. Well, today Russia surpassed North Korea, Syria, and Iran, becoming the country with the most sanctions against it in the world. Most countries are turning away from Russia. It feels like a big deal, but how much does all of that international pressure actually matter if China, one of the largest and strongest and wealthiest countries in the world, is still willing to stand behind them? Let me read you the opening lines of the U.S. readout of a video call between President Biden and the Chinese President Xi Jinping today. Quote, the conversation focused on Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, end quote. Short, simple, to the point. That would totally make sense if that's what the head of state of the two most powerful nations in the world were discussing today. On the other hand, China's readout of the exact same conversation reads like it was from an entirely different conversation. It says China stands for peace in general, but never mentions the word invasion, and like a Kremlin-censored news article, it refers only to the, quote, situation in Ukraine, and that there have been, quote, new major developments in the international landscape. Far from admitting Russia's role as the aggressor here, China would only go so far as to say that the U.S. and NATO should address the, quote, security concerns of both Russia and Ukraine, end quote. Of course, Russia had no valid security concerns from Ukraine, none, absolutely zero. But China's deference toward Russia isn't coming out of nowhere. Early last month, just weeks before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia and China agreed to a new 30-year deal in which Russia would provide oil to China. China is the fastest growing major economy in the world. It needs all the energy it can get. And the deal included building a massive new oil pipeline between the countries, a very helpful thing if you're worried that the West might stop buying your biggest export. That same day, the two countries released a joint statement about, quote, international relations entering a new era, end quote. And the press rightfully zeroed in on a line which said there would be no limits to the two countries' friendship and no, quote, forbidden areas of cooperation. And so now that question of forbidden areas of cooperation is being put to the test. So far, China has not directly condemned Russia's actions in Ukraine. The country has remained incredibly neutral, while much of the rest of the world has sanctioned and stopped trade with Russia because of its actions. In fact, Russia and China have maintained deep economic ties, but the U.S. is now trying to draw a line in the sand. The U.S. is trying to define what the West sees as a forbidden area of cooperation between China and Russia, and that is direct military support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yesterday, Secretary of State Blinken told the press that China will bear responsibility for any actions it takes to support Russia's aggression, and the U.S. will not hesitate to impose costs. It's a point the White House tells us Biden reiterated in detail during his 2-hour call with President Xi today. So if China helps Russia militarily, the United States will hit them with some sort of economic punishment, which sounds simple until you really think about it. For instance, one of the things Russia has reportedly requested from China are non-perishable military food kits. Russia's military has been a logistical mess on the ground in Ukraine so far, and a lack of basic items like non-perishable food is part of why their advances into Ukraine keep stalling. So would providing food be against these rules? And what would the punishments to China actually look like? China is a lot harder to impose trade restrictions on than Russia is. U.S. trade with Russia was paltry. China is among America's largest trading partners. Joining us now is Ambassador Gary Locke. He was the United States ambassador to China during the Obama administration and former governor of Washington State. Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us tonight. This gets complicated because it looks to the rest of the world like everybody's turning on Russia. But if China stays with Russia, Russia can hold out for a lot longer.
Thank you very much, Ali. China is certainly in a predicament because even the images that we have been seeing every day on our television sets is being broadcast to the Chinese people. So they're seeing the incredible destruction, violence, death, and mayhem of Ukraine at the hands of the Russians. At the same time, the Chinese government is still enunciating the Russian line that this is really the fault of the West and NATO for coming so close to the borders of Russia. So China is in a predicament while they have longstanding ties with Russia and would like to displace the Western order invented, devised by the EU and the United States. Nonetheless, the trade between China, the United States, and the EU is 10 times the amount of trade that it does with Russia. So I think China is fearing economic sanctions from the West were it to provide military or even economic aid to Russia.
More troops from the Eastern Military District. They've arrived in Belarus, Sean, and they're crossing the border into Ukraine. There will be fresh troops, not particularly better than what's already there, to be frank about it. Poorly led, poorly trained, likely having low morale, not knowing why they're there. But they're going to put them into the fight. There's also their best military organization is the 1st Guards Tank Army, based in the vicinity of Moscow. They've had a couple of the smaller elements from them in the fight early on. Now they're bringing larger elements out. This is the organization that keeps Putin in power at all costs. So the fact that they are committing them into this fight indicates that they really intend to still take those cities physically. They have not given up on that.
General, maybe I'm thinking out of the box here, but if I was President Zelenskyy, I might think about sending a few special ops forces into Russia and maybe into Moscow and maybe retaliatory strikes within Putin's country. Let him know what it feels like. Any thoughts on that?
Well, we could do that, but it wouldn't be decisive. Because you need mass. And what has been decisive is Zelenskyy's Ukraine combined arms brigades that are stopping the assaults on Kharkiv and also Kiev. These are conventional combined arms units, and they've stopped these guys cold. And that's why they're bringing down these other forces. Mariupol is likely to fall, and they have put ashore now naval infantry, the 8th, 10th Naval Brigade, which is their very best one. It gives you a sense of what the concerns they have here. And they're in that fight in Mariupol. Sadly and regrettably, at some point, that will be the first city that Russia takes control of. So they haven't given up on physical control of these cities, but they will keep up the pressure on the civilians in these cities pretty shamefully.
That's why you're the general and I'm the talk show host. You have this down pat. Great analysis as always. Thanks for being with us. All right, straight ahead tonight, even our adversaries are starting to notice Joe Biden's cognitive decline, his weakness on the world stage. Also, the mob.
What the Chinese do. They don't like to be told what to do. And I'm sure President Biden was pretty stark in laying out what the consequences would be. I'm going to go out on a limb here. My own theory is that I think the Chinese are going to treat the Russians somewhat analogously to the way they treat the North Koreans. They will do some things to help them, but they won't do everything that the Russians want. And I can't conceive that Xi and the leadership of China that surrounds him, his inner circle, want to see Chinese equipment being used against the Ukrainian people. I just don't think they'd be comfortable with that. I do think they'll provide a non-lethal assistance, food for their troops, that sort of thing. Now, I could be wrong, but that's my theory right now.
Yeah, it was interesting, fascinating detail. A battalion commander was telling Ivan Watson that in some of the Russian troops that they have apprehended or killed, they found that the meals that they had, the prepackaged food they had was in some cases extremely old, years old, which gives you a sense of sort of the logistical problems that they're having, which is why they're asking, I guess, the Chinese for MREs, according to U.S. officials. Director Clapper, appreciate it. Thank you. Up next, Don Lemon joins me to preview his exclusive interview with U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, why Austin believes that Russia has made missteps in the Ukraine invasion. He said that to Don. We'll talk to Don in just a moment. And later, we'll elaborate on Director Clapper's theory on China. We'll talk about its role in President Biden's attempt to influence it with Fareed Zakaria.
Mint Mobile figured out how to give you a whole year of service for half the price. So I asked Walker Scobell, the amazing actor playing half-size me in our new movie, to help me announce it.
I play a younger you, Ryan.
Yeah. But the half thing works better for the metaphor. So just you go ahead.
Now when you buy a new phone and half a year of service, Mint will give you another half a year free.
Nailed it.
It's a little silly, no?
Maybe the way you say it.
Yeah, I messed up.
Yeah, think about it. Hey, think on it.
Save yourself money with farmers?
That's not wrong. When you switch your home and auto policies to farmers, you could save yourself an average of $730.
That's something.